Have you ever enjoyed a beverage that was all about harmony, purity, medicinal balance, and was created out of respect for you? That is the Japanese tea ceremony. The history and meaning are as important to the Japanese culture as the preparation and the process of the Japanese tea ceremony. Harmony, purity, respect, and medicinal balance. These are all qualities and aspects of the Japanese tea ceremony as well as Japanese culture in general. My sources of information and processes of the Japanese tea ceremony for today's presentation came from Stephanie Haluska and her research at Marquette University, as well as the Tivana Corporation. Haskala tells us that the history of the Japanese tea ceremony, also known as chunyu, which means hot water for tea, all started with monk Iesai. Monk Iesai brought tea from China over to Japan. He is also one of the first people who used tea for something other than medicinal purposes, and that is he used them for spiritual ones. He also started the process of grinding up tea leaves into a fine powder, adding water to that, and enjoying that as tea. He was a Buddhist monk, which is why Zen Buddhism is associated with the Japanese tea ceremony. Zen Buddhism is about harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility, as is the meaning behind the Japanese tea ceremony. In the 1500s, Sen no Riku practiced the Japanese tea ceremony extensively. He created simplicity and respect out of it and thought that every meeting and ceremony should be unique and special. It was him who created the idea of a small door or gate for the guests to enter, causing them to bow to their hosts as they entered the room that the ceremony would be in. The host bows back silently. And the interior design, utensils, and processes of the Japanese tea ceremony are sacred and very meaningful. The host will practice these processes and hand motions and steps for days before their guests arrive in order to ensure that they have them down properly and do not cause shame to their family, themselves, or their guests. It takes years to master the art of the Japanese tea ceremony, and many people often take classes or join special clubs at schools or university in order to refine their skills. The process of the Japanese tea ceremony is graceful, simple, deliberate, and very defined. It is full of meaning and respect. First, the guests cross the roji, which means dewy grass, in their bare feet. This symbolizes them ridding the dust of the world and purifying themselves and getting ready for the ceremony. They also wash their hands and mouths in a tsukubai, which is a stone basin full of water. This is all to purify themselves before the ceremony begins. They enter through the small door or gate, which causes them to bow to their host. The host silently bows back, and everyone takes a seat. If it is an informal tea ceremony, sweets are served beforehand. If it is a formal tea ceremony, then there will be a meal beforehand, and it can be up to a 4-hour-long 3-course meal before tea is served. The ceremony begins with the host cleaning the utensils in front of the guests. The host then prepares 3 scoops of matcha for each guest into the bowl. Matcha is ground up tea leaves that are used for spiritual balance as well as their medicinal purposes. Hot water is then added with a ladle and briskly whisked with a bamboo stick until it is like a soup-like consistency, adding more water as needed. The host will then turn to the first guest and pass the bowl on to them. They then bow at the host, inspect the tea, turn the bowl before taking a sip, take a sip, then wipe the side where they sipped from, and turn to the next guest and start the process over again. Once each guest has taken their sip of tea, the host will then clean the utensils thoroughly in front of all of the guests. After this process, then the guests will Inspect and admire all the utensils that the host has used in preparing the tea ceremony. Often they will do this using a cloth out of respect for the utensils as well as the host and the culture behind it. You can see the harmony that is in the Japanese tea ceremony from the balance between spiritual and medicinal uses, as well as the calmness that is associated with every aspect and movement of this process and ceremony. There is purity in this ceremony, from the guests walking across the dewy grass to washing their hands and mouth, to the way that the host cleans the utensils in front of them before starting the process and afterwards, as well as the ceremony in general is purifying in its meaning and spiritualism. There is respect evident in the Japanese tea ceremony from the way that the guests treat their host and the host treats their guest, as well as respect for the culture and the ceremony in general. There's a balance between medicinal and spiritual uses for the Japanese tea ceremony, used with the matcha, as well as just the spiritual meaning in general is about balance and tranquility. These principles, while important in the tea ceremony, reflect Japanese life throughout and reveal the Japanese culture through the simplicity yet complexity of the entire process. Stephanie Huskala. She used that quote in her research at Marquette University to symbolize how there is harmony, purity, respect, and balance in the Japanese tea ceremony as well as Japanese culture, and is based on simplicity yet is very complex. Thank you.